everyone, and welcome to the Great American Novel Series, brought to you by The Author's Matrix. I am Uriah Heep, and this is my Literary Cafe. And on tonight's episode, we'll be looking at Chapter 3 of The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield. As you recall, in Chapter 2, we met Addison Way, the hero of our story. The young man going to college and wants to study, of all things, water as a scientist. Everyone says, Addison, why? Why water? They all drink and bathe in and cook in raw sewage water. And Addison thinks this may be the cause of all the illnesses among all the people in the world, especially in Crumbly Village. And he wants to study it. And people don't like it. So, we'll move on to Chapter 3 of The Village Idiot, and we will see you on the other side.
Chapter 3. The following morning, Addison was up before the sun rose. Hunger did not call him to the breakfast table. Addison safely retrieved his notes from their hiding place and eagerly reviewed them in the dim light of a lone candle on his desk. He spent the better part of an hour reading them repeatedly. With each reading, Addison felt he was seeing more and more, greedily poring over each page with the care and precision of a scientist, which he thought he was indeed becoming. As the morning had dawned, Addison could hear his parents stirring in the kitchen, and he knew his mum would call him to breakfast at any moment. He was unwilling to risk any unwanted divulgation of his work, so he gathered his notes and secured them behind his favourite books again. He did not want to risk discovery, so he preemptively made his way to the dining table before either of his parents came to his door. As he sat down at the breakfast table, he sensed that his father's mood had been altered from the previous evening, when it was best, Addison wisely presumed, to avoid him for the evening. "Good morning, my son," Adele chortled with a broad smile that adorned her face. She was evidently in a convivial mood and wished to spread her good cheer to those around her. Addison acknowledged her greeting with a wave of his hand, as his appetite had now revived from the previous evening, and he was eager to eat. Adele placed a bowl amply filled with porridge in front of her son. She sensed his eagerness and wasted no time, bypassing her husband and serving her only son first. Edmund noticed the slight and tried to ignore it, not wishing to disrupt peace in the house. "You must be starving, Addison," said Adele, stating the obvious, as Addison had not eaten dinner with the family the previous evening. Addison looked down as his bowl of porridge overflowed its sides with the remnants of sewage water's less liquid parts, and his face turned ashen. He hesitated to plunge his spoon into the putrid slop before him, and it did not go unnoticed by his father. "Aye, son," Edmund began, "your mother's cooking is not good enough for you anymore." Addison did not wish to answer his father, but his apparent distaste for the meal that awaited his indulgence put him in a perilous position. He could pacify his parents, plunge his spoon into the porridge set before him, and soon find himself gagged on its contents, or he could feign illness and return to his bed and forego a morning meal, which he desperately craved. He was suspicious sewer water had been added to the bowl of porridge. A third option occurred to Addison: relieve himself from eating the porridge before him and extricate himself gracefully from the dining table, thereby avoiding insulting his mother's cooking. He wished not to hurt his mother nor anger his father, so he decided that arriving early at the university to prepare for his morning classes would suffice as a valid excuse all could agree upon. He made that declaration to his parents before gathering his possessions, including his notes from behind his books in his bedroom, and made his way to the village and the university that graced its confines. Upon arrival at the university, Addison first sought out the cafeteria, as his hunger had now reached a point where the pain of an empty stomach was replaced with increasingly alarming fatigue that he could not overcome by will alone. The cafeteria was dimly lit, and only a few students milled around, waiting for the servers to begin their morning shift. Addison waited patiently, sitting beside the iron grate fence, separating him from his much-needed nourishment. It was only a few minutes before the workforce arrived in unison and prepared the morning meal for the students and faculty that began to gather in greater force. "Young Mr. Way," a voice bellowed from behind him, and Addison, recognizing the possessor of that greeting, wheeled around and found his professor, Dr. Underhill, standing over him. "Good morning, Professor," Addison replied in a muted tone. At that moment, before their conversation could continue, the massive iron grate was raised and breakfast awaited. Addison, wasting no time, doffed his cap to the professor and made his way to the line already forming before him. When it was his time to make his selection, his heart sank, and that feeling of nausea began to stir in his stomach. The coffee he yearned for to stimulate him fell from the server's pot, together with chunks of raw sewage, the smell of which overwhelmed the scent of the coffee. Addison groaned, accepted the generous serving without objection, and moved on to the breakfast offerings. He looked at the spread before him, and everything offered for breakfast had been tainted with that same sewer water, whether directly or indirectly, during its preparation. The overall stench that arose from the dining area reeked of that foul, putrid smell that was such a part of life in this village and elsewhere. "Eat up, young man," bellowed Dr. Underhill as he followed Addison back to an empty table at the rear of the cafeteria, far removed from the odor in their presence. While hoping to avoid further interaction with his professor, Addison took a chair he had spied from a distance, only to look up and find his professor sitting astride a chair across from him, eagerly placing his tray in front of him. Professor Underhill stirred his coffee vigorously as the scent rose to his nostrils, and chunks of raw sewage swirled around in a circular fashion, following the movement of his spoon. "I just need hot coffee to rouse my spirits," Professor Underhill stated emphatically. "How about you, Addison?" Nausea and the threat of an empty stomach spewing forth nothing but bile overwhelmed Addison, and he failed to answer the professor's question. Instead, he opened his cup of soup and tried to force himself to drink some of it. The soup was tomato, but the name of the soup failed and did not represent the entirety of its contents. As Addison attempted to take a second spoonful, the remnants of the sewage that had coagulated on the surface, that was enough to dissuade him from any further attempt to satisfy his hunger with this delicacy set before him. "Addison," Professor Underhill asked incredulously, "a young man of your age and stature surely must be famished at this dreadful hour. Are you feeling ill?" He lifted his pale face, smiled grimly at his professor, and attempted to eat some of the eggs that accompanied his coffee. At least the eggs were not scrambled in raw sewage, Addison thought. However, these eggs were tainted with the stench of raw sewage, as the cafeteria's kitchen used voluminous amounts of putrid raw sewage for all of their cooking needs, like everyone else did in the village and elsewhere. "There is no escape," thought Addison, as he became desperate. What possible food is not prepared with raw sewage? Surely there must be something. Meanwhile, Professor Underhill was slopping down his breakfast with a decided enthusiasm that did not go unnoticed by Addison. The simple act of watching this learned professor consume copious amounts of food and drink replete with sewer water furthered Addison's abhorrence of the meal set before him. There was barely a respite between the professor's eating and drinking, for him to inhale and exhale. But he kept up this ritual, which seemed endless to Addison sitting across from him. He had wished the professor had not been so forward as to extend himself an invitation to join him at his table. As disagreeable as the food and drink were to him, watching his professor relish a thoroughly reprehensible meal furthered his disgust and served to extinguish his appetite for the morning. Finally, despite his weakened state, Addison gathered sufficient strength to pose a question to his professor. "Professor Underhill," Addison began meekly, "how can you eat and drink such a meal flush with the most reprehensible ingredients?" The professor gulped his last mouthful of coffee as a chunk of fecal matter fell to the floor and placed his cup gently on the table. I do not understand, Addison. The meal before us, being cafeteria food, is certainly not the gourmet quality that I am accustomed to, but it is wholly adequate. You do not eat, and that is worrisome. The genuine concern of Professor Underhill was felt and appreciated by Addison, but the professor needed help understanding his question. Addison resided in a community accustomed to using raw sewage for all their needs, including cooking, bathing, and drinking. As Addison had grown up in such an atmosphere, he, like everyone else, had little reason to question such a repulsive habit. However, as he entered manhood, the steadfast determination of society to revel in such an incomprehensibly grotesque assuetude began to gnaw at him. "Professor," Addison began quietly, "has it always been this way?" The professor had just shoveled the last bit of his breakfast into his mouth and leaned back with a smug, self-satisfied grin stretching across his ample face. Professor Underhill was distinguished and enjoyed being lauded by his students and colleagues. Although he adorned himself with the title of professor and considered himself distinct from all the other individuals who thought of themselves as scientists, he was prone to self-doubt. His massive girth was intimidating, and he used it to his great advantage. As head of the science department at the university, he was often accused of bullying his lesser colleagues into forming alliances with him on matters he deemed crucial to the department's success. As Addison waited for an answer to his question, which he had doubts the professor heard, he attempted to force a small chunk of egg into his mouth, hoping that would sustain him through his morning classes. "Addison," Professor Underhill finally responded, "I am at a loss as to your query." He wiped his brow of the beads of sweat beginning to form, and a chunk of hair from above his knitted brow dropped to the floor. The newly unmasked bald spot, now visible at the forefront of his head, revealed an open sore, the sight of which ended in the culmination of Addison's last attempts to eat his breakfast. "Speak up, Addison," the professor, ignoring the newly revealed sore on his head, continued. "Has what always been this way?" Addison knew that bringing up the subject directly endangered his position at the university. As a first-year student, he could not risk expulsion by angering the head of the science department. A university, by its very definition, should be a place where all welcome the free and open exchange of ideas, but that was not the case. Nevertheless, despite the dangers before him, he was determined to pursue his further line of inquiry. "The water, Professor," Addison began cautiously. "Is it the best thing for us?" "Cry me, Addison!" Professor Underhill shrieked. "Not again with the water!" The table shook as the professor pounded his fist on it. "What is it about your obsession with water? No one on God's green earth questions the water that sustains us. Why do you?" The professor's virulent response shook Addison, yet he gathered the courage to continue. "The water, Professor Underhill," Addison said. "With all due respect, sir." "I'll have none of this nonsense, Addison," the professor interrupted, as was his custom when he felt his superior knowledge of everything sought to be questioned. "As I recall, Dean Buggs made it amply clear concerning your nonsensical obsession with water. He slapped you down, and rightfully so. This prestigious, world-renowned university will not suffer its brightest students chasing windmills." "I shall go to class, Professor," Addison said meekly, fully aware that this conversation would not end fruitfully for himself and may permanently damage his university career. He gathered his belongings, scooped up the remainder of his half-eaten meal, and made his way to the exit. "Very well, Addison," the professor continued, "but be wary of this foolishness that has gripped you. I would detest seeing such a promising career derailed over such nonsense." Addison did not turn back to his professor and acknowledge that remark. He swiftly descended the long, dark corridor until he came to the lab, where he would have a few moments to calm himself. He was not the only student to arrive at the lab at such an early hour. A smattering of other students set up shop there in preparation for their next class. Addison made his way to the back of the sitting area, where he would remain unmolested by the other students. He proceeded to take out his notes on his experiment with the water that he had absconded with previously. He arranged the documents in a logical order and began a careful review. The water sample he secured the other day showed ample amounts of raw sewage. He had analysed the data retrieved from his experiment last night, but now could delve into a further examination with the fresh eyes of one rested. Why was this kind of experiment never conducted before? Addison wondered to himself. Although his experiment was rudimentary in its scope, it seemed to indicate that raw sewage water contained toxins that would have a deleterious effect on anyone consuming it. "Is this not logical?" Addison said out loud to himself. "What are you doing back there, Addison?" another student shouted from the front of the room. "Talking to yourself, Addison?" The other student was Jake Holzapfel, a long-time acquaintance of Addison going back to their elementary days together. Jake was a congenital sourpuss, as his classmates pegged him well before he had turned 9. He was stout, boorish, and wholly ignorant about most things. How he reached the university was forever a mystery to everyone who knew him. It was said by gossipers of the day that his father's donations to the university smoothed the path for young Jake's entrance, and Jake's performance did nothing to dissuade that rumour. Although unwelcome, as Addison had extended no such invitation, Jake managed to make his way to the back of the sitting area in the lab and sat down next to Addison. As Jake began to speak, Addison surreptitiously slid his right hand over the pile of notes he had spread out on the table and attempted to move them away from the prying eyes of Jake. "What's all this, Addison?" Jake inquired. Jake had a way about him that even his closest friends found irksome. His general disinterest in the lives of his friends, short of praise of himself, took the form of being overly interested in matters that did not concern him. "I am in the midst of an experiment," Addison replied, realizing that he would not be able to dissuade Jake from further inquiry if he attempted to change the subject. Jake reached across the table and swiftly grabbed the notes that Addison was trying to remove from view. He managed to rescue a few of them, but Jake managed to corral a fistful, much to Addison's dismay. "What is all this, my friend?" Jake asked as he shuffled the papers between his meaty hands. Fortunately, Jake could not discern the meaning of the documents he held. He repeatedly shuffled them, futilely attempting to make some sense of them and determine their significance. A few of them fell to the floor, further angering Addison, who tried to remain nonplussed at this individual's unwanted intrusion into his affairs. As Jake continued to rearrange the notes in his hands, over and over again, it was clear to Addison that he needed to provide this mindless hulk standing in front of him some kind of explanation, or the interference would not end. "It is an experiment, Jake, that I am working on." Addison finally relented with a redacted explanation. "It is just in its rudimentary stages and would take more than an hour to explain fully. Why don't you sit down beside me, and I can go further into the depths of this experiment and bring you into the light as to its import." Addison knew his invitation would be unwelcome to Jake, as he would prefer to manage people rather than understand them. Addison took full advantage of that flaw in Jake's character. If Jake had honestly desired to know, Addison might have taken him into his confidence. Still, that desire was sorely lacking in Jake, and he quickly dropped his appeal along with the papers in his hands and walked away, leaving Addison much relieved. This incident further enforced the idea in Addison's mind that the study he was embarking on must be protected from interference from others. Jake was annoyed, but did not present any real danger to his work. Even if he had comprehended the work Addison was embarking on, he could do little with such knowledge. Jake was not respected as a scholar by his friends or professors alike. If he revealed the trustworthy source of Addison's study, nobody on campus would take him seriously. Everyone thought him a fool, and that characterization was essentially correct. Addison continued his furtive experiments for the next 8 months until the end of his first year at the university. There were some dangerous times when he was sure to be found out by his professors, but he managed to deflect any unwanted attention to his work. He managed to keep his parents in the dark too, which distressed him no end but was necessary if he wished to continue his education. As the summer was upon him, Addison took his experiments into the wild, investigating the hills around his home. He loved the massive forest beyond his parents' house and spent many carefree hours exploring it in childhood. These excursions into the woods were not merely mindless romps of a young boy, but rather the beginnings of a developing scientific mind. Now, however, Addison was a severe man determined to see what was true about the world and the water that, he believed, was the source of so much suffering. There was an abandoned shed on the outskirts of the Way's property. It had been there as long as Addison could remember. It was smallish, broken down, and desperately needed repair, but its existence gave Addison an idea. He would house his experiments in the shed, shielded from his parents, without garnering undue attention. Addison spent the first few weeks of his summer break from the university making the necessary repairs to the shed and readying it for his experiments. He managed to construct his makeshift lab in the shed so that if a layperson inadvertently entered it, they would be hard-pressed to discern precisely what activities were taking place. Addison's new lab was the perfect location to launch further studies of the world around him. He often ventured deep into the forest to study nature. Looking at the abundant wildlife around him, he noticed that all the creatures appeared robust, yet no sewer water was available to quench their thirst. He had grown up in a society where the continuous consumption of raw sewer water was considered a blessing from on high. Yet here, in the wilds of the outskirts of the village of Crumbly, the inhabitants of the natural world drank their water from the streams that flowed generously all year long, and they seemed to flourish. This was a mystery to Addison, which he was determined to solve. As a boy, he spent countless hours in these woods, yet never noticed or questioned its wildlife's eating and drinking habits. Now, as a young adult, he felt his eyes were opening up for the first time. The deer would gather at their favorite river's edge every morning, splash about in the chilly, crystal-clear water, and drink greedily to satiate their thirst. Addison had rarely seen a deer that appeared ill. Their eyes were sharp, and their fur coats sleek and shiny, indicating health. "Perhaps it is the water they drink?" asked Addison as he sat perched beside the flowing river, not wishing to disturb the family of deer frolicking at its edge.
So, we have Addison's first year at the university, and he broaches the subject of water that he wants to study. And Professor Underhill thinks he's crazy. Why would you do that? Why would we want to do that? We won't let you do that. And then Addison has a classmate, Jake. A very unlikable person, if you ask me. Jake Hosapple. A bit of a brute. I see trouble coming with Jake, but we'll see. So, that wraps up Chapter 3 of The Village Idiot. Tune in next time, and we'll be listening to Chapter 4 of The Village Idiot. So goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time on the Great American Novel Series, brought to you by the Author's Matrix. I am Uriah Heep, and this is my literary cafe. Goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time.